This question is not as easy to answer as you think it is. Difficulty in Pokemon is a surprisingly complex topic for a number of reasons, but since I just talked about the hardest battles in Pokemon in my last video, I figure now is a great time to discuss whether or not the Pokemon games have actually gotten easier, and if so, is there hope for them to be made difficult again? I think the first thing we need to talk about is what makes a Pokemon game hard, because we need to understand that in order to understand if they've gotten easier. The methods by which a Pokemon game creates challenge can vary a lot, but there are always a few aspects that play a part no matter what, the most obvious of which is the level curve. Level curve as a concept is pretty easy to understand. It's basically how fast opponents get strong level-wise. Games that have a steeper level curve can be harder or more frustrating, just because the EXP you get by playing the game kind of comes at a premium. There are only so many trainers to fight, especially in games without a VS Seeker or rematchable opponents of some kind. And once you're out of them, your ability to level quickly is drastically reduced because you're forced to grind on wild Pokemon, which, while possible, is really annoying and tedious to do. This means if you don't build a team properly and waste EXP, you can put yourself in a pretty frustrating predicament. Level curve isn't always a huge issue in Pokemon games, with the exception being during the Elite Four, especially during some of the older games where the champions would regularly have Pokemon 10 levels higher than the first Elite Four member, which inherently puts the player at a disadvantage because there's no way your team is going to gain 10 levels over the course of 5 trainers. However, there is another time level curves can cause issues, which is when players start skipping battles. This was, once again, primarily an issue in earlier generations, but skipping a bunch of optional trainers could lead to you being underleveled for the next gym, therefore making it harder. Obviously, this has an easy fix. Just go fight the trainers, but it's still an aspect that can add to difficulty. This kind of difficulty is what I would consider game-created difficulty, basically meaning difficulty that comes from the game itself rather than other factors like the player. And there's one more major way a game can create difficulty, which is the Pokemon that opposing trainers use. Obviously, the levels matter the most, but there is still a big difference between fighting a trainer with 6 Magikarps and fighting a trainer with fully evolved Pokemon, right? While trainers with fully evolved Pokemon are generally saved for later in the game, that isn't always the case. And some of the most challenging bosses in Pokemon are the ones that have fully evolved Pokemon early in the game, like Mars and her Purugly or Misty and her Starmie. Other random trainers with well-built teams can also be an issue, especially in late game areas like Victory Road. This can further be exacerbated when games place these trainers off screen to catch you off guard. This was never super common and was mostly reserved for rivals, or areas of the game that you were expected to use Flash. But either way, not being prepared for battle always makes it harder, especially when your opponents have strong Pokemon. Another major aspect that will 100% affect the difficulty of a Pokemon game is you, the player. Your experience with the game will generally dictate how much trouble you have in most fights, even more so than in-game factors, I might argue. Someone who's been playing the game for 30 years with a wealth of knowledge on game mechanics, type matchups, and team building is going to have a much easier time with any game than a 6-year-old who barely knows how to read and is picking up the game for the first time. This is why I personally thought Lorelei was the hardest trainer in Fire Red and Leaf Green, because 7-year-old me was just blasting through the game with Blastoise, and her whole team was pretty good at countering my massive turtle. Even if we look past experience, a player's playstyle will also affect how hard a game is. A player who plays with the Pokemon they like or think are cool, regardless of how good they are, is always going to have more trouble than someone that takes the most meta build ever to blast the game wide open. Other aspects like using healing items in battles, whether or not you use legendaries during the story, and if you play in set or switch mode, back when you had a choice, can all change how difficult a game is, and are all actions or choices made by the player. To be clear, when I'm talking about playstyle, I'm not really talking about challenge runs, because they change difficulty a lot depending on the challenge and the game. This whole analysis is being done assuming you're playing the game with a fairly normal playstyle, not doing a Nuzlocke or a one Pokemon challenge or a monotype challenge or anything like that. There's another aspect of the games that I think used to heavily contribute to challenge but has largely been phased out in recent generations: resource management. This was a huge aspect of why the older Pokemon games felt so hard. A lot of Pokemon had awful movesets back then, and without reusable TMs, building teams efficiently was a lot harder than it is now. Let me give you an example. In the Hoenn region, you only get one TM for Thunderbolt. Who do you use it on? Magneton for the same type attack bonus, or Gardevoir for coverage? Neither of these Pokemon get this move by level up, but both greatly benefit from having it, and you only get one. Unless you want to spend hours grinding in the game corner. You could be put in similar dilemmas for Earthquake, Giga Drain, or Overheat as well, as they're all super valuable moves that you really only get one TM of. Trying to figure out the best time and place to use these valuable items adds a huge layer of complexity to team building, and could lead to the player using worse moves than normal. This wasn't the only aspect of resource management that existed in the older games, as there was one other piece to the puzzle: move slots. Now, obviously this is still a resource that exists to this day, but it was much more important prior to Gen 7 because of HMs, which took up a move slot and were not deletable except at special NPCs. This basically meant that you couldn't use complete movesets on any of your Pokemon until after Victory Road, because you would often need a number of HMs to go through the final dungeon. Obviously, some HMs were decent moves that could be used in battle, like Surf, Waterfall, or even Strength in some cases, but the vast majority just took up a move slot and were never used in battle, like Flash or Rock Smash or Cut. So this was another aspect you had to take into account in older games that you don't really need to now. For the record, I do think these changes are good. HMs were annoying at best, and the way they've been reinvented into Ride Pokemon or Bikemon definitely makes the game feel more enjoyable, and reusable TMs make the game more enjoyable as well. But this does raise an interesting question. Is making the games more difficult worth it if it means making the games less fun? Personally, I don't really think so, but I do think there's a compromise here that can preserve enjoyment and difficulty. But we won't talk about what it looks like until a little later. So, to answer our question, have Pokemon games actually gotten easier? I'm leaning towards probably, but I don't think that was entirely the intention. I think a large part of why the games have gotten easier is just because the games have gotten more accessible. Things like TMs and TRs are renewable. It's way easier to manipulate stats in terms of nature's EVs and IVs. EXP is shared, and strong held items are easier to get earlier in the game as well. All of this makes it easier to play the game how you want to play it, but by making your team easier to build and customize, the games have gotten easier, because 90% of opposing trainers won't have the same degree of customization. When they do though, those trainers can be insanely difficult, like Cynthia in BDSP or Kieran in Scarlet and Violet. So if the Pokemon Company gave every trainer the same attention to detail that those games gave those two, the games would undoubtedly be more difficult. But it wouldn't make a ton of sense thematically. Little Timmy isn't supposed to be as strong as a champion, so it doesn't make sense for him to use the same item spreads they do, you know? Another aspect of the games that I think has made them easier is actually the generational gimmicks. But before I tell you why, please consider subscribing. If everyone watching right now subscribes, I'll be really happy and appreciative. What, did you think you'd be getting something? Like I have big YouTuber money. But seriously, I would really appreciate it. There are two main reasons I think gimmicks make the games easier. First of all, the vast majority of trainers do not make use of the generational gimmicks, which inherently gives you an edge in battle to some degree. Obviously, it does vary depending on the strength of the gimmick. Like a Z move gives you less of an advantage against the average trainer than something like Mega Evolution or Terrestrialization, because the Z move is just one attack, whereas the latter permanently boosts one of your Pokemon for the whole battle. But in pretty much every case, the average trainer does not use the generational gimmick, which makes them easier to beat if you do. The second reason is that even when they do use their gimmicks, I don't feel like they're used super impactfully. This is especially the case in Scarlet and Violet, where Terrestrialization is almost exclusively used for offensive purposes, making it easy to predict and pretty ineffective, especially in the case of Gym Leaders and Elite Four. The same can be said for Mega Evolution and Dynamax users, as the trainers using these gimmicks pretty much always save them for their final Pokemon, meaning if you use the gimmick earlier in the match, you can gain a huge advantage over them with very little drawback, especially in the case for Mega Evolution, as it doesn't run out like Dynamax does. While it isn't really the subject of this video, I do want to mention how the difficulty of dungeons like caves or gym puzzles has also decreased. Actually, I feel like these have drastically fallen off since Pokemon left the grid system. Like, if you compare the victory roads or evil bases you have to traverse when Pokemon was using a 4-way grid to what we have now, it's night and day. To an extent, I do understand this, as strength and sliding puzzles are inherently harder to engineer in an omnidirectional 3D environment. But like, the Zelda series has basically been doing this since 1998, so I don't think it's really that hard, you know? I guess maybe it's hard to integrate Pokemon into the puzzles, but even then I can think of plenty of ways Pokemon could be used in puzzles. Like, imagine a water-based dungeon where you have to heat the water with fire-type moves or cool it with ice-type moves. But I'm getting off topic. Regardless, it doesn't take a genius to see how dungeons have changed since Gen 7, and that does play a role in difficulty, especially when it comes to trainer encounters, as harder dungeons can push you into more uncomfortable and strenuous positions by making you question if it's worth going back to heal or if you need to heal right now. But since the Pokemon games have stopped making intricate dungeons, this factor becomes completely eliminated from the game. There are still other things that affect difficulty as well, like how trainers just have less Pokemon now in general, which inherently isn't a bad thing, but I do kind of feel like the Elite Four members should all have 5 Pokemon, but maybe that's a me thing. This is a change that happened in Gen 6 once the EXP share was changed, as the new EXP share gave so much experience. But since then, the experience share has been tinkered with quite a bit, and the Pokemon Company has gotten better at balancing around it as well. But despite that, the number of Pokemon that trainers have hasn't gone back up for the most part, which I don't really understand. And finally, I want to mention one last potential reason that the games have gotten easier, which is that they're trying to cater towards a wider audience. I call this the Skyrim effect, but it's pretty common in gaming in general. When a game tries to appeal to a wider audience, more often than not, it will shed some of its complexity or difficulty. One of the most notable examples of this is the changes made from Oblivion to Skyrim, with most quests being simplified and many other elements like spellcrafting or stealth being reworked or removed altogether, all for the sake of making the game more approachable to new players. Pokemon is a series that regularly sells well over 10 million copies per mainline release, and as a result, the Pokemon Company probably feels that the games need to be accessible to a wide audience, which could be part of why the more recent games have felt so simplified. It is kind of hard to tell if reducing complexity does actually improve game sales for Pokemon though. On one hand, the original Red, Blue, and Green are still the best-selling games in the series, and they were fairly challenging compared to modern games. But on the other hand, both the second and third best-selling games are the Switch games, which are pretty infamous for being easy, which kind of insinuates that this approach is working. But on the other hand, you could also attribute the sales of the Switch games to the success of the Switch itself, which is one of the best-selling consoles ever made. But on the other hand, the Switch's sales are about equivalent to the sales of the Nintendo DS, which also had a number of Pokemon games, and the Switch games still outsold the DS games in every case by a wide margin. There are also a bunch of other external factors that could affect sales regardless of difficulty, such as COVID or the general economic status of the consumer. So I don't think there's a good way for us to measure how difficulty correlates to sales, but considering how many AAA game studios are focused on a universal player experience, or creating an experience everyone can enjoy, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar mindset was alive at the Pokemon Company as well. And for the record, I know not all AAA studios do this. Obviously some, like FromSoft, Project CD Red, and Rockstar, stay true to what made their games appealing in the first place and found great success there. And I feel like that's probably not the route Pokemon is going, which is why I wanted to bring up this possibility. This does bring us to the last question I want to answer today. Can Pokemon games be made hard again? The simple answer is yes, because we can look at difficulty ROM hacks like Run and Bun or Radical Red to see just how difficult battles can be made. But I think it would be a lot more interesting to ask, can Pokemon games be made hard again in a way that is realistic for Game Freak to actually do? Like, obviously, Game Freak is not going to make a crazy hard game like we have in enhancement hacks, but based on on how they currently or previously made Pokemon games, could Gen 10 be made challenging while still maintaining the mass appeal these games need? I think the answer is yes, and there are a few different avenues they could take. First of all, I think they could bring back resource limitations. Let me explain. I don't mean that TMs or TRs should be one-time use all the time, but I think some sort of usage limit for the story portion of the game would make it more challenging. Maybe there's an upgrade to the TM case that makes it reusable that only champions get access to, or something like that. The same could be said for held items. I think a major reason accessibility has been improved in the Pokemon games was to make competitive Pokemon easier to get into, as it has a ton of barriers making it pretty unapproachable. But now that Champions is out, making held items more accessible is pretty much pointless. So a lot of the stronger ones could be locked to the post-game, or put behind hard challenges to help level the playing field between the player and the NPCs. Another rather simple fix would be having opponents use more Pokemon like they used to. They could lower EXP yields if they're worried about players getting overleveled, or they could just make the endgame fights take place at a higher level. There is really no reason for trainers to still only have 2 or 3 Pokemon, especially for trainer classes such as Ace trainers or veterans. Another option is to bring back the challenge mode from Gen 5, but make it work properly and also maybe introduce it from the start rather than only unlocking it once you beat the game. This could allow players who want a more challenging experience to have one without hampering the experience for newer or more casual fans. The biggest issue I can see with this option is players choosing the challenge mode without understanding how hard it'll make the game, and then getting frustrated with it, which I know sounds dumb, but let's be real, with the current state of gamers, it would 100% happen. One change that I think needs to be implemented in Winds and Waves, if it is open world, which it appears to be, is level scaling of some kind. This was one of the biggest issues with Scarlet and Violet, as it kind of made the game not open world since there was a correct order to follow, basically guiding you through the open world. Level scaling would allow players to truly explore the region in whatever order they wanted to. There are other issues that arise with this though, like figuring out how to manage wild Pokemon to prevent players from using overpowered Pokemon early on. Like if it's truly open world, some people are just going to find broken Pokemon early, which is fine in theory, but can trivialize the game in a lot of ways. But there are different ways the game can be scaled that might be able to deal with this, such as using total experience gained, number of gym badges, or maybe using major story moments as level caps or evolution caps, or something similar. My personal hot take is that Pokemon games don't need to be truly open world. I think an area-based approach like Gen 7 or Legends Arceus is the best state for the series to exist in, but that's a topic for another video. Lastly, I think making bosses use gimmicks more dynamically would make the games more challenging as well. I already sort of mentioned this earlier, but I think making them react to what the player is doing rather than just saving the gimmick for last would make battles much more personal and in many cases much more challenging, as they could use the gimmicks more effectively this way. Obviously, this is dependent on what the next gimmick is and if there even is a gimmick to begin with, but assuming they do, I think this would be a pretty easy change that would make the games better for pretty much everyone playing it. What kind of mechanics or changes would you like to see to make Pokemon games harder? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all I've got for this week though. Sorry for a shorter video this time. I have like 3 huge projects that I'm working on right now, so I just wanted to put something out to tide you over until those are done. Thank you so much for watching as always. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.